Welcome to episode 97 of the GT on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes to 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic. And news broke this week that Dish is launching their first market in Las Vegas. And boy, they're getting down to the wire here because they have to have that coverage requirement done by June, and it's going to involve more than Vegas. But what's interesting about this announcement is that they announced an over $1 billion value deal with Samsung. This is going to involve devices as well as Samsung's 5G vRAN, ORAN compliant solution. And we've talked about Samsung and its capabilities with vRAN and ORAN. This one is just another proof point that really highlights Samsung's leadership in this regard. And I like the fact that Dish is bundling this deal to include not only infrastructure, but handsets. So it's sort of a one-stop shop. So I think it's very, very compelling. Would love to get your views and input on it as well.
Yeah, I obviously have a lot of thoughts about Dish's their rollout. I think 20% is gonna, they're gonna have to cover 60 million people.
Yeah.
And if you look at the cities that they've chosen to cover first, it's gonna be a challenge for them. I'm kind of looking at the map, and as far as big cities go, I think their best chances are probably like Dallas, Houston, and Orlando.
Yeah.
Because Vegas is also a big city, but like Reno, Boise, Spokane, Fond du Lac, those aren't very big cities. So they've got to hit the bigger metros if they want to get this 20% by June. I'm not sure they'll hit it. I actually don't think they will, because I think they would have had to have started this launch sooner in the year.
Right.
But I don't think they'll get penalized either, because I think they agreed to these terms before the pandemic started.
I agree. That's interesting that they could fall back on that, not as an excuse, but we've seen other operators use it as an excuse, like Rakuten, right? But the reality is COVID did slow things down, and so I think if they can demonstrate some solid progress in Vegas, they could get a few other, to your point, bigger metros lit up, then maybe they can get a stay in June. But yeah, it's looking pretty challenging for them. But hey, we had that great podcast with Mark Ruan, and he provided some insight to our viewers and listeners. And it's going to be good to have another carrier in the mix. It's just going to drive further innovation from a service delivery perspective, in my humble opinion. But let's move to your first topic this week. And T-Mobile recently announced earnings, but there was also a big Uncarrier event that occurred today.
Yeah, so they had earnings last week. Since we didn't have a regular episode last week, we didn't cover that.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to cover it because they were actually able to say, they first of all, had great earnings. I think they said that they were at 57 cents per share EPS, which is actually down 23% from the same period last year, but well ahead of the consensus estimates of 33 cents. So they beat on expectations, and they also had 1.3 million net customer adds, which is the best quarterly gain in 8 years. So they're clearly doing well. Obviously, they weren't as profitable as they've been in the past, but they beat everyone's expectations and they added a ton of customers. And they said that looking into the 22 financial year, it sees net customer additions between 5.3 and 5.8 million, which is up from the prior year forecast of 5 to 5.5. So pretty much everything is looking upward, which is really where the share price matters. And if you look at the business fundamentals of what T-Mobile has done with the network and acquiring Sprint, they're definitely accomplishing things at a rate that most people are expecting they will, and even beating their expectations in many cases.
Yeah, I believe the TIOT announcement, that'll be accretive, not right away, but I think we'll start seeing some positive effects from that in subsequent quarters, which should bolster ARPU and margins. And we still haven't seen, other than fixed wireless access services, which we're gonna talk about in a moment here from T-Mobile, really anything discrete other than the TIOT announcement from T-Mobile for Business. So,
Right.
and I've spoken about this in the past. I believe there's a lot of headroom for them to expand in enterprise where they've traditionally been just very solely focused on consumer. So I think the upside for them is building out a fuller portfolio of services and product solutions, connectivity solutions that are geared for that small to mid to even large enterprise market.
Yeah, and so the second part of that is they had the event today,
Right.
literally today. So we'll be publishing this tomorrow, later in the week, but today's Wednesday, and they basically had this event. There's an Uncarrier event, and they made 4 announcements. But the big things is that they're bringing home broadband to their entire customer footprint. You still have to punch in your address to see if you qualify on their website, because they might not think that you have the coverage that is necessary. But all of this is being really enabled by their mid-band network.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at what they're doing here, one, they're locking people in at $50 a month, which is a very competitive price for internet, better than what most people are paying for much slower service. Two, they're letting people test drive their network for 15 days for free. And if they don't like it, they can send back their equipment. And also, they're also doing some really interesting stuff with bundling, because if you're an existing customer, specifically of their top tier plan, they're actually going to give you that home broadband for $30 a month, which is a huge savings, and it is probably cheaper than what you're paying per line in most cases on T-Mobile.
Yeah.
So I think they're really trying to incentivize people to make T-Mobile your one-stop shop for connectivity, whether it's at home or wirelessly, roaming. So I think they're doing some really interesting things. There's obviously some business applications that they're also enabling with this. They're going to allow business users to basically take advantage of the same deal.
Yeah.
They are giving business users a free tablet line as well, so they can manage their business as well as have connectivity. And they're partnered with Cradlepoint to enable some new gateways that will essentially have private 5G networking and other security features that these consumer routers might not have. So I think they're doing the smart thing and creating the first offering as the lowest point of friction. And if a business doesn't think that that offering is good enough for them, they can move up to the Cradlepoint offering, which I know you have a good relationship with them. You probably know that they have some really good offerings in that space. And I think T-Mobile really wants to take advantage of their bigger network footprint, which they did talk about, and the fact that their average speeds are higher. And in general, I think, I'm seeing their network evolving, and I'm seeing now that speeds and the speeds and coverage are great. Now latencies are starting to come down. I'm starting to see, as low as 12 and 13 milliseconds, while also having 500 to 600 megabits down and over 100 up. And when you have all three of those things together, it's it's basically it's like that catalyst for 5G success.
Yeah, it's a killer combination. I like the Cradlepoint relationship. Cradlepoint is obviously a part of Ericsson now. Ericsson is using Cradlepoint to push itself further into the enterprise. So I like that move. Cradlepoint has a very mature product line. They've been doing private LTE solutions and L5G solutions for quite some time. And so I think that's super smart. The aspect that I liked about the consumer part of the announcement today was the try it before you buy it, right? So you mentioned, for 15 days, you can get the product shipped to you. You can set it alongside your current setup in your home. Do the Pepsi challenge. I'm going to date myself there. I remember when Pepsi, sent the little kits out with a can of Pepsi and a can of Coke, and people did the comparison. T-Mobile's kind of taking that approach here. I think it's super clever. I think it has the potential to really accelerate the subscriber base that they've done a great job of building up until now. So yeah, lots of great information today. You and I were both on that call with other analysts and journalists, and there were some live tweets that you and I both put out there. So
I got to ask. I also got to ask a question.
Yeah, you were able to ask a question. So for our viewers and listeners, get out there on Twitter, @Anshel at Willtown Tech, and you'll see some of that input. But let's move to my second topic this week. I want to talk about U.S. Cellular. So they've announced that they're launching a 5G millimeter wave service in 10 rural parts of the country, 10 rural cities. And so the question I have, is it a smart move? I think it absolutely is, to focus on a fixed wireless access solution. I've talked about how FWA is absolutely going to be a part of solving the digital divide. And this allows US Cellular, which traditionally they're obviously much smaller than than T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T, but they serve a rural footprint. But it was interesting to read through the announcement that they're also going to focus on larger urban areas as well. But I think they're smart to start with rural, because that's where I really believe fixed wireless access can make a difference. But wondering if you have any additional insight to add.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the important thing here is that, they are trying to take advantage of the fact that where they play tends to be more rural. And also, a lot of the places that they tend to be playing are flatter. So as long as they have, the masts in place, they can potentially get, I think, what is up to 6 or 7 miles of coverage with FWA. And, I grew up in the Midwest, so, I'm familiar with a lot of the places that that they're launching in.
Yeah.
And, I think when you look at what kind of internet services are available in a lot of these places, it's kind of embarrassing. And I think anybody having good internet service, especially when they're talking about, what is it, 300 megabit service,
Yeah.
that's life changing for somebody who's been dealing with 10 to 30 at best. And I think long term, if we really improve internet connectivity in this country, I think there's a lot more potential to potentially alleviate some of the housing problems we have in this country, with too many people focusing to live in too few areas. And once you let people spread out and give them internet connectivity, I think you change the way people who live in rural areas can compete with people who live in cities.
Yeah, I totally agree. It gets back to that whole notion of the gig economy. There are so many people that are reevaluating what they're doing, exiting the pandemic, finding better work-life balance. And part of that is being able to work from anywhere. And having more ubiquitous broadband is going to help facilitate that. It's going to drive positive GDP for the economy. It's a win-win. You and I have talked about the race to 5G and why China was trying to get there first before the US. I mean, there's a real economic advantage there. And connectivity, clearly, when you provide ubiquitous connectivity, it can up level lots of things like inclusion and economic prosperity. And that's why I'm writing that book, The Human Network. I continue to work on it. And hopefully, now that we're putting the pandemic in the rearview mirror, I'll be able to get out there and take some of those international trips. And on future podcasts, I'll talk more about the book and provide updates. But let's move to your second topic this week. You want to talk about a Google acquisition and how that could complement its 5G Edge and XR play.
Yeah, so this company is an edge computing company called MobiledgeX. It's actually a spin out of Deutsche Telekom, and they got acquired by Google, specifically Google Cloud. And when you consider that Google Cloud is, in many cases in a tertiary position to AWS and Azure, I think they recognize that they're going to have a competitive cloud offering that is edge aware.
Right.
We know AWS has lots of that already in play, as does Microsoft.
Right.
But we haven't heard as much from the edge from Google. But I think that they obviously have a play. But having MobiledgeX, I think, helps them, because MobiledgeX has so much experience working with carriers. They were funded by VMware, Samsung, and SK Telecom, so they already had some venture capital put into them from carriers. And the CEO, while he isn't transitioning with the company into Google Cloud, the company itself said that they have they have the ability to ensure that now 25 mobile operators, which they have already worked with on their edge cloudlets, can interface with other edges around the globe. So they're creating this platform for Google to use to immediately make themselves effective with 5G operators. And I became familiar with MobiledgeX during AWE when they presented on XR and talked about how they were enabling, automotive XR solutions in a 5G network, and allowing for low latency, high performance applications, on the network on the move. So I definitely think there's some really interesting things that they're doing, and I think Google acquiring them definitely helps them. Specifically, Google Cloud helps them with their edge play, both in edge compute as well as XR, which I think is one of probably the most compute intensive and low latency necessary applications for the 5G network and mobile edge compute.
Without a doubt, those are great insights. And I totally agree with you. This allows Google to catch up to Azure and AWS. As you mentioned, Azure and AWS have been making tremendous investments in mobile edge compute. And no surprise, we've talked about Verizon and their partnership with AWS in that regard. So this seems like it's a pretty quick way for Google to step up their game there. And I wasn't as familiar with MobiledgeX as you were. I had no idea that they had those proof of concept, design wins, whatnot with 25 plus operators. So that provides a lot of credibility as they try to carve their niche into the telco cloud space. But let's move to my third and final topic this week, and I want to talk about AST SpaceMobile, and they're testing satellite-based services on AT&T spectrum. And honestly, when I thought of AST, I thought of the computer brand back from the 80s. Again, I'm going to date myself, but I did a little bit of research. They're a 5-year-old company that's actually based in Midland, Texas. So that's basically in the middle of nowhere in West Texas. But what they're trying to attempt to do is the company is claiming that they are building the first and only space-based cellular broadband network that is designed to be accessible directly by standard mobile phones, right? And so this is, from my perspective, pretty game changing. And so the nature of the announcement with AT&T is that AST SpaceMobile is going to use AT&T's 846.5 to 849 megahertz license in Midland. It's 845 to 846.5 megahertz license in Honolulu, and it's 788 to 798 megahertz license in Pine Springs, Texas. And the last one is significant because it is connected to FirstNet, which obviously AT&T has built for first responders. So this is a pretty interesting way to go about providing cellular-based service regardless of where you are. I'm just wondering, what are your insights?
I think I haven't done as much research on AST SpaceMobile and how they're using the spectrum. But I think it's interesting because satellite is only going to become more relevant in the 5G space with release 17. And I think its applications will become more relevant in 18, and probably mature to a point where satellite becomes a component carrier among all others. And maybe satellite becomes, the base level carrier for voice and text, and then all other data travels over, terrestrial networks. That way you always have voice and text no matter where you go.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be interesting to see how this pans out as a partnership. But to your point, the fact that FirstNet is a big part of this, I think there are some opportunities to enable connectivity for first responders in places where there isn't any. And hopefully that's going to be the primary use case looking forward.
That's an interesting point that you make, because I did spend time with AT&T. I think I've spoken about this on a prior podcast in New Orleans, and I went to one of the areas where they had a lot of the FirstNet gear stage. And typically in a highly remote area that isn't served by, cellular service, they have to take basically a portable cell on wheels or a light or Colt, and it's satellite connected as well, right? And that's, I mean, to deploy that and set it up, it takes time. And so to be able to sort of augment FirstNet with something like this, I absolutely agree with you. It sounds very compelling on the surface. And this is the first that I learned about, what AST SpaceMobile was doing. They've been around for 5 years, shame on me. But I'm going to be keeping my eyes, because satellite in general is something that's very fascinating to me, and LEO and how that's all going to sort of fit together to bridge the digital divide. So, but let's move to your third and final topic this week. And you've got an update on C-band FAA drama.
Yeah, so yesterday, May 3rd, the FAA said they'll meet today with telecom and industry officials to push a retrofit and ultimately replace some airplane radio altimeters that could face interference from C-band 5G wireless service.
Yeah.
This is a story from Reuters. And what's interesting is not too long ago, like less than a week ago, there was a statement from Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, who's in charge of the FAA, saying that the issue won't be completely resolved by summer, which I believe had been a previous promise that had been made when this started late last year and blew up early this year. And no surprise, it's not resolved and won't be probably till the end of the year, if not longer. But what's interesting is that the FAA wants to use this meeting that's happening today to establish an achievable time frame for retrofit and replacement of radar altimeters in the U.S. fleet, and they want to ask aviation representatives to offer options and commit to actions necessary to meet those objectives. So I have a feeling that there's still money that's going to have to change hands to make this happen.
For sure.
I think that ultimately the airlines want to be, they want their costs covered. And I think that's really at the crux of all this. But the reality is we know that at least 90% of all commercial flights are safe. So it's less than 10% of planes might have a problem, and they don't actually know what the actual percentage is. But I do believe that once they do figure that out, they should replace those altimeters, because they're probably decades old.
Yeah.
And they probably needed replacing anyways. So
Right.
this is definitely a very much airline problem. And I think the airlines have successfully managed to kick the can down the road long enough, because this is not the first time that C-band has been considered an issue for airplanes, but it is the first time that there's 90 billion plus on the table, and I think that they want their piece of that, and whatever that piece is, I think they're going to get it, honestly, because I think the FAA just wants this to go away at this point, and I think that's kind of what the airliners have always wanted. It's just, they tried to play scare tactics early on, and it became very clear that this wasn't a real concern in most cases. And yes, while airline safety in the U.S. is paramount and probably the safest in the world, using that approach to airline safety to kick around a political football is also not necessarily very genuine or honest.
No, it's not. And it just, again, we've spoken about this on numerous podcasts, but it's just, two federal government agencies not talking to one another. I mean, at the end of the day, the FCC has raised billions of dollars on C-band. Peel off a couple hundred, and cover the altimeter, replacement, and don't bother the general public. Don't get the operators involved, just deal with it on your own. But easier said than done. But hey, buddy, it was another great podcast this week. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights for a future 5G topic for the next podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in next week.